Hi, I'm Jack Baker. This presentation is going to be a discussion of presentations. We're going to discuss how to give technical presentations that are effective uses of your time and your audience's time. The motivation for this material is that, assuming you all are engineers, but regardless of the career path you choose, whether it's in structural engineering or risk analysis or some non-technical field, you're almost certainly going to give presentations about technical material at some point. And doing it well is a great effective mechanism for you sharing a message, and a nice presentation is going to give credibility to the results you're presenting. Conversely, if you do a bad job with the presentation, you can undermine what otherwise might have been very good technical material. If people can't understand your point, if they don't focus on the things you want them to focus on, or if they gather from a poor presentation style that you're not competent in what you're doing, those are all, of course, very bad outcomes. And so here what I want to talk about for a few slides is some relatively simple tips so that the visual component of your presentation can shine. So I'm thinking primarily about the PowerPoint slides that you present. You also want to think about the message and the style of presentation of the non-visual part of your presentation, but here we'll focus on that visual part. And these are relatively simple tips. I don't think you'll find them hard to adopt, but they'll increase the impact of your work. Okay, so thinking about moving into a presentation, I like to start off all of my presentations with a motivation slide. You'll have seen that in some of the videos I've posted. And the motivation slide, for me, is my initial, the process of developing that slide helps me think about, why am I presenting this material to my audience? Why should they find it interesting? What's the topic? And what's the question we're going to be exploring, right? And if I can come up with that story myself, then that helps me identify what I should be focusing on in the presentation. And as long as you've gone through the exercise of thinking through why you're presenting this, you might as well just tell your audience. There's no need for them to be guessing at it based on your later slides. Just tell them, here's what I'm studying and here's why it's important. And if they see that up front, then they're going to be a lot more willing to engage and concentrate through your presentation to understand the material you have to present for them. You've probably seen people present an organization slide at the start of their presentation. So lots of people get up and give these kind of sub-bullet points. They'll say, okay, I'm going to start my presentation with an introduction. Then I'm going to give you some background on the topic. I'm going to present some analysis and show you my results, and then I'm going to close with my conclusions. And I feel like that's just when I see that, my eyes, I just kind of zone out for a minute, because anybody who's giving a good talk should roughly follow that structure. And so to go tell everybody that you're using that structure, you're not really giving them any new information. To me, that's just a kind of a waste of some precious time you have in front of the audience, and you're better off just getting into the interesting parts of the presentation, and they'll see your structure naturally if you use a logical structure to present your material. So then the question comes, before you start presenting your new material, do you need to present some background? And that's a question I get a lot from students, is how much background should I include? How much time should I spend providing background? And the filter you can think about to try to figure this out is you want to think about your audience, so specifically who is in the room that you're presenting to, because that's your audience is going to vary in terms of, some circumstances you'll see a very highly technical audience, in some cases you'll see a less technical audience. And you want to think about that particular audience. What do they absolutely need to learn before they can understand your contributions? And if they don't need it, you don't want to include it. And so, because you don't want to waste a bunch of time giving them background on material that's not related to your topic, you want to get to your point if possible. So keep this to a minimum and keep it to just what your specific audience needs. And the other thing that I think is a really wise idea is to bring that background material into your results slides. If you spend a bunch of time up front presenting background before you show any results, the audience is going to have a harder time understanding why they need to learn that background. If you wait until the last minute, right when you need it, the context will be clear. You say, okay, here's a calculation. Let me give you, some background on this piece of this calculation that I'm doing. They'll see exactly why they need it, and they also won't have to remember it for very long before they see how it's applied. So I think it's, rather than having 2 or 3 or 5 slides up front on background, if you can just kind of present that material along with your results, that's generally a more effective strategy. Okay, in terms of some kind of logistics of your slides, some format suggestions. And by the way, for my class, I'm going to provide this exact PowerPoint file on Canvas. So you're welcome to just take this template and adapt it for your own presentations, because it kind of follows the rules that I'm going to give you here. And so let's think about some rules. So first suggestion, that's regardless of template, is I always put numbers on my slides. So you'll see the number up in the upper right-hand corner here. I think that's really important for question and answer time or discussion, as you've probably seen that where somebody at the end of a presentation has a question to say, I have a question about that middle section where you presented result X. Could you go back? And then everybody sits and waits while the presenter scrolls back and they say, oh, no, that's too far. Go forward. No, go forward another slide. Oh, that's too far. Go back. And it's much easier if, when the audience, when they see something and they're puzzled about it, they can just jot down or remember, oh, that was slide 6. And then at the end of the presentation, you say, can you go back to slide 6? Can we talk about that? Or if you need to refer back to a previous result, you can refer back to a slide number as well. It's a very easy thing to just help give some guideposts, just like page numbers on a book. You wouldn't want to read a book that doesn't have page numbers on it. In terms of the templating, so you want to use a font and a size that's easy to read, even if the projector is relatively low resolution, and even if people are in the back of a room. So in terms of readability, typically we want to use fonts without serifs. So that's kind of a little bit of a technical detail. But the font on this slide is a sans serif font or a no serif font. And then also I think this size of a font is also relatively readable in most circumstances. In terms of the kind of decorations on the slide and the permutations, you don't want to use a bunch of different colors or a bunch of different fonts or a bunch of different sizes and all that stuff. It's just going to distract the audience from your messaging. I really try to use kind of 1 or 2 colors on a slide. So you can see I've just got black text here, except for the slide title is in blue. And I've only got kind of 2 font sizes, and like a font size for the title and 1 for the text. Occasionally I'll use 2 different font sizes for the text, but I'll try to minimize that even. If you're using, multiple different sizes, that's just going to be distracting. And then, certainly if you're using multiple fonts, there's really, no reason to be doing that except kind of out of laziness. PowerPoint will sometimes mess up your fonts, but with a little bit of thought, just kind of holding that stuff consistently will, again, keep the audience, visually pleased with what you're showing and keep them focused on your message rather than kind of distracting junk that's been thrown into the slides. The other thing is I always use a white background with dark fonts. You see the picture below, the kind of classic Steve Jobs presentation. So when he would introduce products, he'd use these dark screens with white text, and it's kind of visually appealing. But it's a little extra work to set things up that way. If you're going to produce figures, having your software produce figures that have a dark background and a white font to match your slide template, that's kind of a hassle. If you're ever going to print out your slides, it's kind of a hassle to have a dark background. So to me, just a simple white background, crisp white background with some dark fonts is the very easy, practical choice for the layout. Some other tips on slide formats is that when you are putting some text in here, use complete sentences if you can. So these are all, on these bullet points, these are all short, complete sentences. It's very tempting sometimes to kind of leave out a verb and just have like a subject and an object, but then it gets much tougher for the audience to understand what you're saying. Same thing with the title of the slides. Try to be a little bit descriptive there. Don't just say like formats. Try to say, this is other tips around slide formats. You can animate in bullet points. I try to do that really sparingly. Otherwise, you kind of spend a bunch of time just clicking through animation rather than having your audience, look at your content. And try to not just give big, long bullet point lists. So I'm really on the edge here, just putting some bullet points here. But that's just because I'm trying to get some content in here for you to have documented down. But in terms of a visually appealing slide that was going to keep an audience captivated, this is a pretty bad choice of a slide here specifically. So some examples of these types of things. So here's a PowerPoint layout that's a bad one. This is an example taken from Edward Tufte, who's somebody who's spoken a lot about PowerPoint templates. So this middle slide here is a slide from the presentation by somebody in the U.S. military. So we have this very long list of bullet points. We have non-complete sentences in terms of these bullet points. So I see down in kind of the middle of the slide, police ineffectual, army ineffectual. So as a kind of expert in whatever's going on here, I have no idea what, is that a criticism or is that an observation? Or, I'm not really sure because there's no verb in here. There's no complete sentence to tell me what's going on. There's also, a lot of complex color coding and things like that. And the criticism here was even for kind of people who knew what the topic was. There's a lot of kind of missing information on the slide that makes it hard for the audience to understand what the point is of some of this stuff. Here's another example. This is it was kind of a joke PowerPoint presentation from the Gettysburg Address. And here again, the lack of complete sentences makes things really confusing. So, what makes nation unique? Conceived in liberty. Just a couple extra words would get us to complete sentences, and that would be much easier to understand. The other point is just that there's not much kind of visually to present here. There's just kind of a lot of junk in terms of rectangles and different fonts and different sizes and bullet points that it's not really adding anything to your audience's understanding of the topic. When you're presenting results in the form of charts, which is pretty likely if you're doing kind of quantitative results, one thing that I think helps focus me is to say, try to get rid of chart junk. That's another term from Edward Tufte. So the figure on the left, this is kind of a default MATLAB result. So I've got kind of my MATLAB quick code down below. I've just plotted x versus some function and turned on the grid. And so I've got kind of a very thin line, blue line, showing my actual function that I'm trying to tell you about. And then I've got all sorts of grid lines and labels and all this stuff sitting here. So the percentage of ink on the left-hand side that's actually related to my function is a pretty low percentage. On the right, with a couple extra commands to kind of take off the grids and reduce the axis label, the number of axis labels and things like that, and make the line heavier, now the visual focus is on the line rather than on kind of the junk. I've increased the font sizes so it's easier to read what the numbers are and what the axis labels are. And, if there's really a specific number that you need to read off of this plot, we could always annotate it on there. Or if the specific numbers are really critical, you might think about putting a grid on the figure in some cases, but as a default, that stuff is generally just distracting from the part of the figure that you're trying to convey to your audience. Another thing that we'll sometimes have to deal with is tables. And so if you've got a big table of numbers, you want to think real carefully about what to do with it. So let's say I had a table like this over on the right. If I'm going to put that in a slide, I got to think about what's my goal here. And if my goal is that you're going to read all the numbers off this table and understand it, that's a bad goal, right? That's not realistic for somebody sitting in a room listening to a presentation to kind of process dozens of numbers in a small font. So the question would be, why would I put a table into a presentation? So I might do this to say, well, here's a big set of data, and let me call out, this particular number here where I've got this particularly high value or particular low value, and I could highlight something specific. So that might be a reason to do it, though I'd still consider doing that with caution. The other reason I might do it, it would just be to advertise the availability of some data. And I might just say, this is really kind of like decoration. And I just say, look, this information is available, and you can obtain the numbers later, whether it's in a corresponding report or it's at some web address or something like that. And so I could think about some text like in the lower left to say, I did this calculation for a bunch of ground motions, and you can get the results at this following URL. So if I've done a nice job with my presentation of exciting the audience, and they see this table and say, oh, that looks like something I'd like to have those numbers for my calculations, then they might go track it down later. But they're not going to read the numbers off the slide while I'm presenting it in person. In terms of what to actually present to be efficient, you want to show some results to convey what you've done, but you want to help tell your story with them and not just present them for the sake of presenting them. So one way that I think is really effective to present results is to kind of repeat a figure format. So every time you put up a figure, the audience is going to have to figure out what you're showing, right? They're going to look at your axis labels and say, what are you plotting against what? What are the numerical values? What's interesting here? And they're trying to do all this calculation, all this processing, and you're talking at the same time. And so you're competing with your own figure for the information. But if you repeat a figure format, you can gain some extra efficiency. So here's a figure that some of you may recognize from earlier in the 289 class. And so what I've got here is a plot where in all three figures, the axes are the same, and I've kind of stacked them vertically. I didn't put numerical values on here to kind of simplify things, but it's implied that the x-axis scale is the same. And then I said, okay, for these three figures, this is increasing values of omega out of this function here. Right? And so I don't have to figure out exactly what's going on with that function, but I can see that as omega gets bigger, moving from top to bottom, that the nature of this plot is changing. Right? And so you as an audience member, you just have to look at one of these figures to figure out what's getting plotted and see, okay, that's an autocorrelation. And then you can browse across these to see what's changing really quickly without having to kind of do any sort of math in your head to understand what's going on with that function. Right? And then, even a nicer layout is to have kind of some figures with some text as well to kind of provide additional data. So this type of layout that I've got up on the screen, I've got a figure and then I've got some text over on the left to explain the point. That serves a couple of purposes. So one is if you're going to give out handouts that the audience will take home, then they've got a reference. So those of you who've got my handouts from class, you've got that reference that the text stands alongside the figures, even if I'm not there to talk about them. The other thing is if there's any chance of miscommunication with the verbal presentation, either because you are struggling with the presentation in terms of volume or language or things like that, or if your audience has any trouble being able to process what you're saying, the text gives a little backup system to understand what's going on. Here's another example of kind of figures with text. So this is an original slide from 289, right? So I had a descriptive title. So I said, okay, this is the response of an oscillator to white noise input. And then we've got some kind of equations, and the equations map over to the figure over on the side. And then I say, okay, well, here's our result, and that maps over to a figure on the side as well. So we've got kind of some sparse text on the left, some equations, and then some figures on the right that all repeat this kind of the same figure layout, so that you can do these kind of comparative evaluations. That's a general scheme that I find to be a relatively effective scheme for presenting results, along with the math and the concepts at the same time. Here's another example figure from a different presentation outside of class, looking at kind of repeated figures. So on the right, I've got kind of 6 different stacked figures that all have the same time scale on the horizontal axis. And then on the vertical axis, there's kind of some different things being plotted. Up top, we've got kind of the second and the third figure. The point here was to kind of discuss decomposition of time series into wavelets, a discrete wavelet and a continuous wavelet. And you can kind of see the similarity between the second and the third figure that I would elaborate on in terms of what's going on there. In the bottom 3 figures, I've got kind of some processing of earthquake ground motion. And in all 3 cases, the horizontal and the vertical axes are the same. So you can really see this kind of stacked up comparison of the differences among these things. So some things to think about here is when I've got this repeated horizontal axis, the time axis, I can actually omit it from kind of the top and the middle figure out of this lower panel here. That just simplifies up the figure. It gets rid of that chart junk and really emphasizes that you can do this vertical comparison across the 3 subfigures. And then also, notice I've got the fonts kind of relatively clean there so that they're relatively easy to read for the audience. There may be a little bit on the small side here, but given kind of the amount of text on these, I couldn't push the font size too much bigger. Here's another example of a repeated figure. So here the font size on the figure is a little bit bigger. I've got kind of the number of damaged elements. Doesn't matter what the context is here. This stack of 4 different plots. They've all got the same horizontal axis. In this case, I guess I did actually leave the x-axis values in these subfigures. Those could have been omitted as well to even further simplify things. Notice the vertical axis limits are the same in all 4 subfigures, so it's very easy to kind of compare heights of bars up and down. And then what's varying from figure to figure is this correlation coefficient, this rho coefficient. And for your presentation, or for this discussion today, it's not so critical what's going on in this figure. The point is that you can see very clearly that as that rho coefficient changes from the top to the bottom, that the pattern is changing in terms of these probabilities. And that's the point that I was trying to draw out with this presentation, with that figure in particular. Okay, thinking about other strategies for presentations. So you want to think about when there's really important messages, you want to give your audience more than one chance to hear them. So this figure the photograph is the one I think about, right? When it's really important that cars stop at this intersection, you're going to want to give them more than one chance to see stop. Give them a stop sign, give them a mark on the road. And then that's going to increase the chance that they actually get the message and follow it, right? Same thing for you with the presentation. If you really got an important point, try multiple ways to get it across. Give them a figure to show it, give them some text or an equation to kind of make your point, and then say it with words. This is important. This is what I'm trying to highlight for you. And then your audience will have a better chance that they walk away understanding that key point. Back to visual examples. So here's an example where I did use some animation, and you'll notice in kind of my presentations to you in general, I haven't used a lot of animation. I just find it to be distracting. If you want to put something on the slide, just get it up there. But this was a case where I was presenting a calculation. There was an integral, and I had kind of a couple terms in the integral, so I wanted to explain kind of where those terms came from. And specifically, there was a probability calculation that was coming from some data. And so I said, okay, well, the data is coming from this left figure, and then there's a kind of a Y threshold that I'm interested in exceeding, and so I can pick a Y value, and I can fit probability distributions superimposed in here, and then the probability of exceeding that Y given some value is going to be this shaded region. Right? And so that was a case where I thought that kind of dumping all this in one step would be maybe a little bit too much to process, but kind of animating in some steps would help indicate kind of where the term came from for that equation. So you can think about if there's some kind of multi-step calculations you may want to animate in, but I wouldn't just take a list of bullet points with 4 bullet points and animate in the bullet points one at a time. I think that doesn't really serve much purpose. Okay, another topic to think about is kind of how long is your presentation going to be, and how many slides might you consider including in a presentation of that length. So here's my rules of thumb. This kind of gets you started. So if it's a technical presentation, so this is like your class presentation or a presentation at a conference or something like that, I like to take about 1 to 2 minutes per slide. Maybe more on the 1 minute side, so that I can kind of get a reasonable amount of content in. But any faster than, any less than 1 minute per slide, I'm going to be rushed. You might have some real simple slides, maybe like you're just showing some photographs or something like that, and you want to click through a few photos to show examples. I would still try to give yourself at least 30 seconds per slide. If you're going by a slide in less than 30 seconds, you're not really giving your audience enough chance to process what's up on the page. If you're clicking through every 5 seconds or something, the audience they're just identifying kind of that you've changed the slide in the first few seconds, and definitely not kind of remembering anything that they'll know more than a few seconds later. And then when I teach, right, so lots of you have seen me teaching, I slow down a lot more there, right? And especially if I'm going to add some kind of text to the slide, I try to aim for something like 5 minutes per slide in a circumstance like that. And this really has a lot to do with your goals of your presentation, right? So if it's a teaching presentation, I really want to aim for kind of an in-depth understanding of the content that's being presented. So we need to go real slow and methodically. And we need to do some examples and let the audience do some writing. If it's a technical presentation, the goal is more to just highlight some interesting issues. And so you can generally go faster in a situation like that. Okay. So thinking about your presentation for the class, you're going to have 15 minutes to give a presentation. So I would aim to start with something like 12 to 15 slides as kind of a rule of thumb. You don't need a lot more than that. And so I would start with that. And then what I would do is put together the presentation and then rehearse it. Try to give the presentation to a friend or give it in front of a mirror or something like that. See how long it takes you, and then you can adjust the length a little bit after that. If you get through it and you see you're running over time, you can pull a little bit out, or you can add a little bit of material if you're going faster than you need to. So this is just kind of rules of thumb to get you started. But really the mistake that you can make is trying to pack too much in rather than not present enough. I've seen lots of times where people have a 15-minute presentation and they bring in 60 slides and they try to tell you everything they've ever studied in their whole career, and they fly through it and probably they understand it all because it's things they've been thinking about for a long time. But for you, it was just like a whirlwind of slides that flashed by, and just as you were kind of getting yourself oriented to the material on the slide, they're moved on to the next slide. And after a few minutes, I generally will just kind of tune out when people are going through that much material. So kind of keeping the message simpler, trying not to blast people with like every piece of information, just highlighting the kind of key concepts. That'll really make for a more effective presentation in general. Another thought in terms of these presentations. So, I'm giving you some advice about technical presentations here. The advice differs a little bit from what's going on with my lecturing to you. And so I want to kind of highlight some differences, right? So when I'm lecturing to you, I really don't need background material because we have a very similar context. We're all coming into the class day after day, and we all have the same information the previous lecture, so we all know where we're picking up, and I don't have to give you a lot of background, right? The first day or two, we'll go through a little bit of background, but we don't really need it day to day, right? So in a technical presentation, maybe a little less so for your class project, but as you're out in the real world giving presentations, you might need to think about a little bit of background material and say, for this audience, I've got to make sure that they understand the context of what I'm presenting. For my lecture notes, I've got a very homogeneous audience in that you all have kind of a very specific level of training. You all have some prerequisite classes. And so I can assume kind of a level of prerequisite understanding. For a technical presentation, you're typically going to have a more diverse audience, right? There are going to be some people who might be experts in what you're talking about, and some people who have no idea what you're talking about. And the question I get again a lot is how do I handle that when there's some experts in the room and also some novices in the room? And usually what I'll try to do with a technical presentation is give a little bit of material for both of those people. And so if the novice is in the room, if I can give them a little bit of high-level context or a little bit of background that educates them a bit, hopefully they'll find that informative. And if there's a few slides that are really getting into some technical nuts and bolts, they'll understand that they're not going to be able to follow everything if they're novices, and they'll be patient with you through that. On the other hand, for the experts in the room, if they see you present some nice background or some nice context in a way that shows you really understand the big picture of what you're doing, they'll be patient through that, even if that's material that they kind of knew ahead of time. But it'll build credibility that you clearly know what you're talking about. And then when you get to those few slides of more in-depth technical material, that's some nice material for them. So I think nobody in the audience expects to be have every single slide in your presentation perfectly tailored to their level of understanding. But overall, if you give a polished presentation, if it's clear that you've put some thought into the material you're presenting, and you give everybody kind of some bits and pieces that are interesting, and then some bits and pieces where maybe they can zone out a little bit and get some cognitive relief for a few minutes, and that can be a pretty effective way to handle a diverse audience situation. Okay, so moving to the next row here. So in terms of pace, right, I'm going to go at a relatively slow pace for lecture notes. I want to kind of talk through things slowly and hope that the audience can kind of replicate my calculations if need be. For that technical presentation, right, we can go at a much faster pace because your goal is really to just give a highlights of what you've done. If they're really interested, they can go find your report or your written material later, or they can follow up with some questions to kind of understand some more details. Right. In terms of my lecturing, right, I'm typically lecturing for 110 minutes. So I've got this very long interval of time to be teaching. So again, I can get into a lot more detail because of that. The other thing, though, is that no human can really concentrate for 110 minutes. So we have to do a couple things to deal with this long length. So one is to take a break in the middle for sure and stretch our legs and get some oxygen back into our brain. But the other thing is we need to have some level of participation, right? So we want the audience to stop and do some writing and do some processing on their own, maybe have some discussion, some question and answer and things like that. Otherwise, it's just not realistic to think that kind of somebody could sit there for 110 minutes just listening and have very much recall of what they had. Okay. For a technical presentation, right, there's lots of presentations that are kind of 10 to 15 minutes, up to like 45 minutes is kind of the longest format of kind of keynote technical presentation I ever give. So at that shorter interval of time, and especially at the low end of this, the 15-minute level, the content's going to be much more general. And I'm really going to focus on the audience just remembering one or a few things rather than remembering like something from each slide. Okay. When I'm teaching, right, my ultimate goal is kind of learning, right? I want people to learn something. So I'm going to finish with my learning objectives and say, here's what I want you to have learned out of this material. And if this thing that I want you to have learned looks unfamiliar to you as an audience member, then that's a flag to kind of restudy that material and figure out how to resolve that. With the technical presentation, I'm going to finish with conclusions and say, here's kind of the big takeaways from this. And it may not be something that the audience learns as much as something that you just want them to be aware of. Okay? And these presentations kind of serve, and the presentation materials serve a couple different purposes. So when I'm teaching, right, I'm using these lecture notes. One is a place to build kind of reference material. So I'm passing over a set of figures and text in a printout version or as an online upload. That's going to be a reference for the students to use into the future, whether the near-term future or the long-term future. It's also a place where I want people to be taking notes. So I'm going to leave a little bit of space and leave a little bit of time for some note-taking. With a technical presentation, that's less the case, right? You're less likely to be handing out a set of copies of the slides. And it's less likely that this is a presentation you're going to want people to reference, weeks or years down the road. The material is really, I like to think about it as a sales pitch, right? You're trying to make the case for something. And it's not necessarily that you want people to buy something, but you want them to believe that the topic you've studied is important, or you want them to walk away with an interest in trying this technique that you've proposed as a good technique for solving some particular problem. And so you want to focus your material around making that pitch, telling that story, so that they get to the same conclusion that you get to. Okay, so this conclusions that we want to finish with, let's think about that slide for a little bit. And so, I said on the previous slide, maybe one thing to remember, let's be ambitious. Let's think about kind of 2 to 3 things to remember. What would you want your audience to remember if you could implant 2 to 3 things in their brain, right? Or if you talk to your audience, a week later and said, what did you remember from my presentation? What do you want them to be able to say back to you? And here are the things that I like to think about. First, just what's the topic you're working on? What problem are you trying to solve? And then in terms of the work you did, are there key techniques you used for, is it, some sort of analysis or some sort of an experiment that was a really important technique to solve this problem? Are there some key assumptions or some key limitations to your work? That can be interesting as well. So I've got this method, it works really well in some circumstances, it doesn't work in these other circumstances. That's an interesting thing. And then, is there some sort of new result or new conclusion that you've come to that you really want the audience to leave with? And so if those are kind of, 3 big areas where you can inform your audience, make sure you say those things. Your conclusions can focus around those. And honestly, if you're in one of a whole sequence of presentations, really, if they can remember item number 1, you've been a success, right? So thinking about our final class presentations, you're going to be one of a dozen or so presentations. And so for each person in the audience to remember, 6 items out of each of the 12 presentations, that would be a lot to take in one afternoon. The same thing happens at technical conferences or workshops. There's usually a lot of presentations, and you want to stand out just by making those kind of one or a few really key points and trying to emphasize those so that your audience remembers those. Okay, so coming back to this handout or this set of slides, the conclusions from this material I've just been presenting to you are as follows. So one is that there's a few simple strategies that can make your presentations much more effective. So there's 2 things to this, right? So there's the more effective, and my goal is to try to give you the pitch that you can do a better job with your time and your audience's time if you use some of these strategies, and that these strategies are relatively simple, right? I'm not telling you to do anything that would take hours or weeks of preparation. It really just requires some thought. And a lot of this is always, comes down to putting yourself in your audience's shoes, right? How are they going to be interested? What do they need to know in terms of background? How can you help them kind of learn the material or process the material you're presenting to them? Okay, and that's the second bullet point, right? It doesn't take much extra time to produce good materials, and so I think this is a place where you really get good cost benefit. A little extra time makes everything work much better. And the high level keys to being successful here is your audience's perspective. I think that's probably the most important thing. If you can, and it's a hard thing to do. It's a simple thing to say, right? You spend a bunch of time becoming an expert in some sort of topic, and then you have to step back and forget that you're an expert and try to speak to your audience who's not an expert. And sometimes you can take things for granted that are going to be hard for your audience to understand. So trying to keep their perspective in mind, what do they know? What are they going to be interested in? That'll really help you decide how to craft your story. And then that story is important, so stay focused on the story. And that means, I think some ways you can stay focused is to start with that motivation slide. See if you can tell your story up front. What are you trying to tell the audience? What's important about this? And then I think I would also, you can get there through your conclusion slide. So if you start by working on the motivation slide, and maybe second or jointly work on the conclusion slide, and say, well, what am I wanting the audience to leave with? So if you do those 2 things first, then third, you can kind of fill in the details in between. And what this will do is this will keep you, if you lead with the motivation and conclusions in terms of your organization, it will kind of keep you focused on that story. And then the stuff you fill in the middle will be serving that story. If you don't start this way, if you don't think about your motivation or your conclusions, you just start putting together slides, it's really easy to fall into the trap of like, well, I did this calculation, I've got a figure, I might as well just dump it in the presentation. And you're not really asking the question of like, just because I have this figure, is it really going to help my audience? Just because I have this figure, is it more important than something else I could do with my time in front of the audience? And so that, putting some scaffolding around it, around motivations and conclusions will really help you to make those decisions. And then when you're presenting your results, keep the results clean visually. And by that, I mean, don't throw lots of decorations and fonts and colors in there. Don't throw lots of extra labels and text and lines and things on your figures. Kind of keep the material focused on the story and don't have distracting stuff in there, because your audience will get distracted and they won't be focusing on the things you want them to focus on. Okay, so these are just some high level advice in a few minutes based on my experience over the years trying to think about how to present effectively. If you want to kind of dig into this deeper, there's all sorts of resources available for you. A few of my favorites are here down at the bottom. So Edward Tufte in particular is a person who's talked about this a lot. He has a book called The Visual Display of Quantitative Information. That's an interesting one, talking about kind of the concepts of how to display information in an effective way. And then here's a couple of URLs as well with kind of tips about what to do and what not to do when giving presentations. You'll see some of the ideas that I've presented here, as well as some others if you want to dig a little bit deeper in those things.